Alright, we have come to section 9, the last section of this course. The section is called Building Your Own Rx. In this first video, we'll recap on Redux and we will introduce something called subjects. So what we're trying to do is to recreate Redux by using Rxjs. So the content of this course is as follows. We're going to try to look at Redux and see a vanilla implementation so we understand the concepts, and it will also give us a chance to recap and explain the artifacts that make out Redux. We will then talk about recreating Redux in Rxjs and what we actually need to re-implement and the things we need to consider. Lastly, we'll introduce the subject and especially how the behavior subject might be a good mechanism for doing pub/sub, publish, subscribe. We are looking at a vanilla implementation of Redux. As you can see here, we have a Redux.js file. The different artifacts that exist in Redux are reducers, actions, the store, and a state inside of the store. We have chosen to implement the store as a class. It could definitely be a function as well, depending on how you do it. So first off, we have the store and the constructor in which we first set the listeners to an empty array. And we have an initial state where a language is empty, and then we have a products array. Next thing we have is a dispatch method. This is a method that takes an action in, and depending on what the action does, it will affect either the products or the language state. But as with all Redux implementations, all the reducers are run all the time for every dispatch. So this means that even though we can say that we only affect a certain state here, for example, products reducer only affects state products, language reducer only affects language, and the whole idea is for the action type to be of a certain event message. If you're a reducer, you should only be listening to one specific. When you have reducers, you have different message type that is being handled by different reducers. So here, for example, we see that language reducer takes care of the message language load, whereas the products reducer take care of product add. You would never have a case inside of the language reducer where it takes care of product add as well, because that might lead to corrupt data. So the idea is for one type of event message to only occur in one reducer. But you can definitely have different event types in one and the same reducer. Moving on, we see here inside of the dispatch that once we change the state, we tell the listeners about it and we even send them the state here. Next, we have a subscribe method, which essentially allows for a listener to sign up. We also have an unsubscribe in which we filter out the listener that shouldn't be part of it anymore. Then we have a supportive getValue method. This is definitely optional, but it's a nice thing when you try to diagnose that your store works as it should. Speaking of which, we are actually going to add a console log, just called store value, for the sake of knowing what the initial state is. So we're just going to move this. Then we have the select method, and the idea here is for it to send in a function. The function should operate on the state and only select slice that it wants. Then we instantiate the store. We also have this console log that we just added that shows us the initial state of the store. Then we call subscribe, which means that we add a listener to the store, and the listener should be told about the fact that a state is being changed. Now, speaking of states being changed, the store dispatch here and here is the ones changing the state. So remember the initial state we had here with a language that points to an empty string and a products array, which is empty. When we call dispatch, this means that the product reducer will be the target because that's the one who knows how to handle a message of type product add. We give it a payload of an object with a name movie. That means that the products array will increase its items by 1. When we dispatch a language load message, we will change from an empty string to the characters EN, which essentially is a shortened version of English. So that's the code. Let's have a look at the terminal and running this code so we see that it works as intended. Let's try to run our Redux store. We're running it and it comes to an end. So the first thing it says is initial state. It says that the language is an empty string, our products is an empty array. Then we dispatch the first event, which is essentially adding a product to the products list. So it goes on from being an empty array to containing one item. So we see that event message is working. next order of business is to change the language. And we can see here from line 2 to line 3 how we go from an empty string to it containing en. So we see that the language change message is working as well. So this is the way that Redux should be working. We should be adding one or dispatching one action after the other, and gradually our state is being more and more changed into what we want it to be. However, because this is a publish subscribe pattern, that means that we can have more than one listener. So let's have a look at what that can look like. So the only thing we need to do at this point is to enable this code that we disabled, which essentially sets up another listener, as you can see. Let's head back to the terminal. Okay then, let's run our code again. And this time we see that we get double messages of everything, which is essentially because we have two different listeners. So both subscriber 1 and 2 is being reached by the fact that a new movie has been entered. Both subscriber 1 and 2 is reached by the message that the language has changed from empty string to English. Okay then, we are back inside of our solution again, and this time is time to start talking about where to take this next. And the next step we want to take is to go from a vanilla implementation to actually start using Rxjs. So what's the reason for using Rxjs? Well, a lot of the things we do currently is manual. The way that we subscribe as a listener, the way that we unsubscribe, the way that we publish data is very manual. And a library like the event emitter or like Rxjs can definitely help us with that. Also, the way that we compute state is something that especially Rxjs could help us with. So there are definitely benefits to involving a third-party library at this point to clean up our store. So next off, we'll look at how to recreate this from the beginning. But before we come this long, let's go through some artifacts in Rxjs so we understand what parts of Rxjs lends itself to be used for this new implementation. Okay then, let's talk about Rxjs in the context of Redux, why we are considering Rxjs at all. We've said previously that Rxjs is reactive, so in a sense the whole pub/sub mechanism is there, right? Because if you look at one of the core artifacts, which is an observable that we get from invoking the of operator. So when we're using the of operator, we're creating this static array list and it's emitting that data by item. And by using the subscribe method, we're able to see that happening. So that's interesting. That's the pub/sub mechanism. Let's take a step back here. Let's think about the overall model that Rxjs and observables represent, which is a stream of data. So normally when we say a stream of data, we mean like first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And whatever this is, that could be mouse clicks, that could be static values, that can be a lot of things. And even if you use like an interval operator, then the data gets sent with a certain delay. And yes, that's also part of the whole model. However, looking at Redux here for a second, let's have a look at what kind of events are being emitted. So with Redux, you usually don't think about mouse clicks, but you rather think about things that affects your global state. If we look at our previous examples with languages and products, let's try to use that analogy on Redux, but seen from the viewpoint of streaming and Rxjs. So instead of it streaming values like 1, 2, 3, 4 or mouse clicks, in Redux we might have a scenario where an action is being dispatched and the product is being added, then another action and switch to English is being dispatched. Then comes another product, and then comes another action which represents that I should remove a product. As you can see, we can definitely model what happens in Redux as a stream of events where we do things to the global state. With that said, observables, are they the best possible artifact to use for this? Thinking about it, when we use an observable to create this stream of 1, 2, 3, what we're actually doing is we are deciding there and then this is the content that you're ever going to have. Never going to have anything else. Now that to me doesn't really sound like Redux, right? Because a lot of the things that happens in Redux is user driven. You don't know at what point in time a product will arrive or the user will decide to change to English. That to me sounds like another artifact, which is the subject. Now subject is an interesting beast. It's two things in Rxjs. It is an observable that people can subscribe to, but it's also an observer, which means that we have the ability to tell it, here comes another piece of data that can be published. So let's have a look at some code I wrote to actually initialize a subject, subscribe to it, and affect the stream. Looking at it here, we see that we initialize the subject, we see that we set up a subscription, we also see that we emit values. And this is nowhere near like an observable behavior, right? The only thing observable here is the subscribe, whereas the other ones are about emitting data and affecting the data. This to me sounds more robust. So imagine that this is a product arriving, imagine that this is another product, this is language being switched to English and so on. Stream.next is something we can call at any point in time, and we know that that will show up here. Any listeners will get the message that the 1 or the 2 or the 3 has actually been entered to the stream. Okay, so we're about to run our code. I just want to run it by you quickly, the different code pieces that we have. So we have the observable here, where we set up all the values from the beginning, then we subscribe as they are emitted. We came to the conclusion this is not a good model for how Redux and especially UI applications work, because the events that represents the data here might arrive at any time. For that reason, we are instead considering a subject as a good model for this, as we are able to subscribe first, and then we're able to do next, next, and next for every time you can imagine that the user does something to our application, which could be adding a product or changing the language and so on. But seeing is believing, so let's try to run this code in the terminal. Okay then, now we're in the terminal, we run npm start, and we can discuss the results. Here you can see that the subject does what it's supposed to, which means that it emits the data 1, 2, 3, and the subscription happens first, and then we start emitting the data. So what I want you to see here is that yes, we can affect the stream afterwards, after we start subscribing, which is an important distinction. Okay then, we are looking at a sample of a behavior subject. Now, this has a lot of likeness to that of a subject. We've already said that subject was probably the artifact that was best suited to model a state change in Redux, because we said that, well, the state changes kind of looks like a data flow of emitting values. But behavior subject brings something else to the table, and that something else is the initial value. So why is that important? Well, if you look at a Redux store, it has this initial value. If we go to the Redux, you'll see that. So here, for example, inside of the constructor, you see that we give it this initial value. So subjects need to have that initial value as well. So we need to affect them after the fact, like we do here, but we also need to bring this initial value. That's why the behavior subject is an even better version of the subject. That's really the pre-knowledge we need to have before we continue on to build our own Redux using. Okay, we've reached the summary of this video. Let's recap of what we've learned. So we showed a vanilla implementation of Redux. We discussed the different artifacts that made Redux up. Next thing we discussed is how state changes can be modeled as streams in Rxjs. So finally, we had a look at different artifacts such as observable, subject, and behavior subject, and we found that observables were not really a good match when it comes to describing streams, and definitely the way that Redux and state changes work. Subject was more up to the job, behavior subject was even better.